It is the second week of March and rain has not let up on Pine Mountain in 4 days straight. Down in the spring house where my family has kept root vegetables and put up jars for 4 generations, water is running down the limestone wall in a thin, steady sheet, the way it has every spring thaw since before I was born. What I am holding in this jelly jar right now is a clear liquid, the color of weak tea, and it costs about $7 a quart at the hardware store in town. It is capable of turning a wet, weeping stone wall into something water cannot get through again, not this spring, not 30 springs from now. Stone foundation, old hand-mixed mortar, poured concrete floor. It works on every one of them. The stonemasons who built half the foundations in this county before 1960 carried a bottle of this in their tool bucket, and a few of the old-timers up Big Creek still mix it themselves, completely legally, on the same foundations their grandfathers laid by hand. My name is Ruth Combs. My family has farmed the same hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky for 4 generations. Grandmother Loretta kept 13 dozen eggs in a stone crock in this very spring house every November, lowered down into a cloudy liquid she mixed herself, and we ate fresh-tasting eggs from that crock clear into April, with no icebox and barely any electricity to speak of. That liquid in her egg crock and the liquid sealing this wall today are the exact same chemical. I am going to show you both, and I am going to show you why nobody in the hardware store will tell you that. Now, after my last video about keeping a root cellar dry through the spring thaw, a lot of you asked me the same question. What do you do when the cellar already has a coat of that black roofing tar painted on the walls, and it is still leaking? And the answer changed everything I thought I knew about how water actually gets into stone. Here is the part most folks have never been told. Your foundation is not a solid wall. It is a network of capillaries, thousands of them, tunnels so fine you cannot see a single one with your bare eye, but they work exactly the way the roots of a plant work. Water does not just sit against the outside of your stone and wait. It gets pulled in, upward and sideways, by capillary pressure, the same pull that draws coffee up into a paper towel laid across a spill. That black tar paint you bought at the hardware store does not stop that pull. It cannot. It sits on top of the stone like a raincoat, and a raincoat does not stop sweat. The water that was already inside your wall before you ever painted it stays trapped behind that coating, and every winter when the ground freezes and thaws, that trapped water expands and pushes, until the tar cracks, peels, and lets in more water than you had to start with. That is not bad luck. That is the design. Now, I have to say a true word about this before we go any further, because I spent 5 years as a nurse in Lexington before I came home to this farm, and I know how to read a label. I know what the bucket at the hardware store promises. I also know what my grandmother used when there was no hardware store within 30 miles and no money to spend there if there had been. There is no profit in a quart bottle that costs $7 and lasts a lifetime. There is very good profit in a 5-gallon bucket of black tar that you have to scrape off and reapply every 3 or 4 years. I am not telling you the tar company is lying to you about how it works in the short term. I am telling you they are not in the business of selling you something that only needs to be bought once. The liquid in my jar is called sodium silicate, and old-timers in this part of the country, the few who still remember it, call it water glass. It is not new. It is not some internet trick somebody dreamed up last year. A German chemist named Johann Nepomuk von Fuchs worked it out systematically in 1818, dissolving silica and soda ash together until he had a liquid that hardened into something that looked like glass when it dried. That is where the name came from. By the late 1800s, Farm families on both sides of the Atlantic had figured out the same liquid would keep an egg fresh for months in a stone crock with no ice at all, because it sealed the shell shut and kept air and bacteria from getting in. That is exactly what Grandmother Loretta was doing in this spring house every November, whether she knew the chemistry or not. She just knew it worked, and that was enough for her. Now, here is what surprised me when I first looked into why this is not something every hardware clerk in America can explain to you. Sodium silicate does not sit on top of stone or concrete the way tar does. It penetrates. When it touches the calcium hydroxide that is already present in old lime mortar or in cured concrete, it triggers a real chemical reaction. That reaction produces calcium silicate hydrate, which happens to be the exact same compound that gives concrete its hardness in the first place. It does not stop. It keeps reacting. The liquid is not coating your wall. It is becoming part of your wall, filling those capillaries from the inside until water has nowhere left to travel. No membrane to crack, no surface to peel. A transformation, not a layer. Now, let me tell you why this nearly disappeared off of American farms by the middle of the last century, because once you understand it, the rest of this is going to make you a little bit angry. And then I am going to ask you to set that anger down. There was a stonemason in this county named Emmett Caudle, who laid foundations, spring houses, and root cellars from one end of the holler to the other for almost 50 years before he passed. My husband Daniel apprenticed under him for 2 summers before the mine closed. Emmett never got called back for a leak, not once in 50 years of work. When Daniel finally asked him why, Emmett walked him down to a foundation he had poured in 1971, pulled a brown glass bottle out of a feed sack, and said, "Because I finish every job with this, and I never tell the supply house I'm doing it." That bottle cost him less than $1 back then. It still works on that foundation today. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, the building supply companies that manufactured elastomeric coatings and roofing tar built relationships with trade schools and apprenticeship programs all across this country. They donated the materials students trained on. They sponsored the demonstrations. It was not a conspiracy with men meeting in a back room. It was something much simpler and much more effective. An entire generation of young masons and contractors learned to waterproof a foundation using products with a profit margin built into the can, and nobody ever stood in front of them and mentioned the $7 bottle that did the same job permanently. The knowledge was not banned. It was just quietly left out of the lesson plan, which is a different thing, but it gets you to the same place. Now, if you already have a foundation or a cellar wall with old sealant on it, stay with me because this next part is for you specifically. You do not need to chip out your wall. You do not need to hire anybody. You do not need more than a few dollars of material for a wall the size of most root cellars in this county. Here is exactly what works, step by step, the way Emmett taught my husband and the way I have done it twice now on this farm myself. First, look at what is already on your wall. Anywhere the old coating is bubbled, peeling, or lifts when you tug a corner of it with a putty knife, that has to come off. A stiff wire brush and a little elbow grease will take care of most of it. Anywhere the old coating is still solidly stuck down and will not budge, leave it alone. The sodium silicate is going to travel in through whatever stone or mortar is exposed, and it will work its way sideways from there. You do not need every inch bare. You need an entry point. Second, wash the wall down hard. A bucket of warm water, a good grease-cutting dish soap, and a stiff bristled scrub brush. Scrub it like you mean it. You are going to watch gray, chalky residue come off that stone that has probably been sitting in those pores for decades. Rinse it, scrub it again, and rinse it until the water running off the bottom of the wall runs clear instead of cloudy. Third, and this is the rule you cannot skip, the wall needs to be damp, not soaked, when you apply the silicate. Press your palm flat against the stone. It should feel cool and a little moist, the way a sponge feels after you have wrung it out hard, with no water dripping but the coolness still there. This is the opposite of everything you have been told about painting a wall. The silicate needs that moisture to carry it deep into the stone and to fuel the chemical reaction once it gets there. If the wall is bone dry, the liquid evaporates on the surface before it ever penetrates, and you are left with nothing but a faint white film that does you no good at all. Fourth, mix 1 part sodium silicate to 2 parts clean water in a plastic bucket. If your wall is very old and very porous, mix it 1 to 1 instead, stronger, so it closes the bigger pores faster. Pour the mixture onto the wall in generous sections, working from the bottom up, and work it in with an old paintbrush or a stiff push broom, pressing it into the stone rather than just brushing across the top of it. You are not painting a fence. You are forcing liquid into a network of tunnels you cannot see. Watch the stone change color as it drinks the liquid in. That color change is your proof it is working. Fifth, let that first coat sit for about 4 hours. Then come back and put on the second coat, this time undiluted straight from the bottle. This second pass does not need to travel as deep because the first coat has already filled the larger capillaries. It finishes the job by closing the finer pores at the surface and hardening that outer layer. Let the whole wall cure for at least 24 hours before you stack anything against it or let standing water touch it again. We had a hard storm hit this farm about a month after I treated the springhouse wall myself. 2 days of steady rain, the kind that used to send me down there with a flashlight checking for puddles around the potato bins. That time I never went down to check. The morning after it cleared, I walked down anyway, out of habit more than worry, and the wall was beaded with water sitting on the surface in round little drops, the way water sits on a freshly waxed truck hood instead of soaking in. Not one wet patch on the floor. Not one dark line creeping up from the baseboard. The stone had taken what Loretta's egg crock already knew, and it had turned itself into something water could not get a foothold in. Now let me be honest about what this will not do, because I will not waste your time with false hope. This is not a fix for a cracked foundation that has actually shifted or settled, and it is not going to seal a gap wide enough to slide a coin through. For a crack like that, you need mortar or hydraulic cement first, and the silicate after, working together, not one instead of the other. This is also not an instant process. It wants a damp morning and a few hours of patience, not a Tuesday evening rush job before dark. And it will not work nearly as well sprayed onto a bone-dry wall in the heat of a July afternoon, because the chemistry needs that moisture to do its work. Know what this tool is for, and it will serve you for the rest of your life. Ask it to do something it was never built for, and it will disappoint you, and that will not be the tool's fault. That is not a conspiracy, what happened to this liquid over the last 70 years. It is just how the money flows. A company that profits every time you climb back up on your roof or back down into your cellar with another bucket has no reason to go out of its way and teach you the one thing that would put a stop to that. Grandmother Loretta never knew the name Johann Nepomuk von Fuchs, and she never needed to. She only knew that the holler provided what her family needed to keep food and shelter dry through a hard winter, and that a woman who could seal her own cellar wall with what she mixed in a bucket did not need to ask the company in town for permission to keep her family fed and dry. So here's what I want you to do this weekend. 1. Walk down to whatever wall in your house has given you trouble, a cellar, a basement, a crawl space, it does not matter which. 2. Press your hand against it and find out whether what is already on there is holding tight or lifting loose. 3. Scrub that wall down properly with soap and water before you do one more thing to it. 4. Pick a cool, damp morning this week, not a dry afternoon, and put down your first coat. 5. Write the date on a scrap of paper and tape it near that wall, so a year from now you remember exactly what you did and when. Until then, go check the dampest wall in your house with your bare hand before you spend another $1 on a bucket of anything from the hardware store. Tell me in the comments, does your family have an old root cellar or spring house? And has anybody kept it dry without store-bought sealant? Because the women who kept this country alive through hard winters and harder years knew things we are only just beginning to remember. Don't let it die with a generation.